needs are a huge part of Alzheimer's. And we all know physical needs is a big part of it. But if you are a hands-on caregiver for a loved one, it can be a little tricky, because it starts out in the early stage. You think, this isn't so bad. I don't mind helping hubby with his shoes, or mom with getting dressed in the morning. You think, I can handle this. But that's the tricky thing, is because Alzheimer's starts out up here and ends up down here. And those physical needs grow exponentially as the disease progresses. At first, you're helping them cut up their food, but at the end, you're feeding them. Cutting up their food takes 30 seconds. Feeding them a full meal when they're barely eating takes several hours. Getting them dressed might take half an hour. Giving them a bath is a multi-hour procedure, and it's a lot more physically intensive. At the end of the disease, the requirements, the physical needs of Alzheimer's are all-inclusive. I was feeding Grandpa, I was dressing him, I was bathing him. If he needed to go anywhere, I wheeled him in a wheelchair. I had to pick him out of the wheelchair and put him into bed. I had to lift him out of bed and put him into a wheelchair. If you do not have the physical energy or strength to do those things, there will be some point along the journey where you have to give up being the physical caregiver for that person in your life. And you need to recognize that and prepare in advance for it. Because otherwise you'll run to that point and it'll be a crisis. I can't do this for my loved one anymore. What am I going to do? And you will have a crisis on your hands. So as a starting caregiver, don't get fooled by how it's easy to take care of those physical needs in the early stages. Recognize where it's going and recognize where your limits are and make plans ahead of time if you can't do it the whole way. But physical needs are not the only needs. And that's where we can kind of get preoccupied with our preconceptions. And that we think, this person I know can't remember how to use a light switch anymore. How can they possibly have need for mental stimulation? But it's not true. It isn't, even though it seems that way to us, and that mental stimulation is a crucial need for someone going through Alzheimer's. Now, it does change throughout the course of the journey. In the early stages, when they're just a little bit sick, their mental stimulation will look fairly much like a normal, healthy person. And as it progresses, it will change, but it doesn't go away. For Grandpa, in the early stages, his need for mental stimulation was fulfilled in his daily routine. He got up in the morning, went to the kitchen, I made him coffee, and he drank his coffee, ate his breakfast, looked through the newspaper, listened to the radio, then got up, went to the living room, and watched TV. Later, he'd get up and he'd go back into the kitchen and wash the dishes. At that point, he couldn't actually wash dishes anymore. He would rattle around in the sink, and gosh, that faucet was just a bugger to figure out how to use. He might end up washing his dentures with the kitchen scrubber, or scrubbing the kitchen dishes with his denture brush, and forgetting kind of what he was doing anymore, but he was in the kitchen, he was doing things, by golly. And then he'd take a nap, and then later in the day he'd go out and get the mail. He might get the mail 3 times and bring it in only once, but he was getting the mail, by golly. And that way he felt he had a full and active day. He felt like he was doing things. Now, yes, it was kind of a mimicry, a shadow of the life he used to have, but it made his day feel fulfilled. Now, as the disease progressed, he started losing the ability to do those things at all. And then a great avenue for activity for him became the magazine rack in the kitchen. It was actually a stand, and it was a little half-height wooden stand with a table on top, and magazines would be stuffed in containers on the side. And he'd sit there on the couch, and he'd take out each of those magazines, and he'd look through them. He liked baby magazines the best. He liked looking at pictures of the babies and thinking about what they were doing, what their mommies thought of them. But even a Fine Home and Gardens magazine was good enough, as long as it had lots of pictures. He'd flip through, carefully smoothing out those pages and looking at those pictures. Occasionally he'd stop, and he'd tear out a strip of a page, and carefully fold that strip of page up in a nice neat little square, and make a stack of little squares of paper next to him on the couch. And when he got done, he'd make those magazines a nice neat stack, and he'd put them back into the magazine rack, and then he'd need to adjust the magazine rack. And he might even decide that magazine rack needed to go on the couch, like a piece of artwork, and he'd put it on the couch and he'd look at it. He could have hours of fun with that magazine rack. And you see, when my grandfather was a healthy adult, he was a very artistic man. He would paint and draw, he would carve, he would make canoes, he would play the piano and play the mandolin and the guitar, he would build things. He was a man of his hands. And in Alzheimer's, he couldn't do those things anymore, but he still remembered the pleasure of neat and square edges, of pictures and colors and texture and order. And so those magazines gave him gratification in the same way that all those more intricate activities did previously in his life. And as his disease progressed, he took great pleasure from me practicing the guitar. Now, I was wretched. I was horrible at it. But just sitting there with him and plucking out those chords, trying to, brought back memories for him. He enjoyed sitting there. And sometimes kind of like them bursting out of him that seemed related to nothing, but you could tell his mind was working. One time he made some comment about the D chord, which at that point I didn't even know what the D chord was, but I went afterwards to look it up and found out, yeah, it was a really difficult chord, and I realized he was trying to tell me that D chord was difficult. And he enjoyed it so much when I read him bedtime stories at night. He loved it when I put him to bed at night if I read him from books, read him stories from books. So all throughout his journey of Alzheimer's, those mental stimulations gave him great gratification. Now, somebody in your life, if they've had a different experience, different pleasures growing up and throughout their adult life, they'll want other things. If you know somebody who's a sewer or a knitter, what they'll probably enjoy is fabric, folding fabric, the color, the texture. They'll probably have great pleasure spending hours feeling and folding and arranging cloth. Now, somebody who spent most of their life being very social, they might prefer to have people sit and talk with them, or maybe they like dolls, to talk to the dolls, and they get the dolls dressed and have the dolls keep them company. It will vary very much from person to person, but you need to recognize what satisfies their mental needs and try to meet those needs, because if not, if they have nothing to keep them occupied, then their sickness will occupy their mind. Alzheimer's becomes like a black hole, and it sucks people towards it, and it makes them agitate and agitate and agitate if they have nothing else to occupy their mind with. So if you can give them mental activities to do, they'll be much happier, and you will be much happier. Now, there's also a huge need for emotional support. Alzheimer's is a very emotional disease. Someone who is sick with Alzheimer's loses a lot of their higher mental functioning, but they become very tuned in to their emotions and to your emotions. And that's tough, I'll tell you. But sometimes Grandpa made me very exasperated, but he detected the least bit of exasperation in my voice, and he becomes so hurt. It was like, why is Rundy exasperated with me? What have I done to get him exasperated? And it wasn't anything that much. You certainly couldn't explain it to him. And so I had to be very careful to always put on a good emotional demeanor. But then Grandpa needed a lot of support. And everybody who has Alzheimer's will need a lot of emotional support. For some people, it varies what exactly they struggle with most. But everybody, I think, will struggle with loneliness to some degree. Some of them want it answered by having to talk with them. Grandpa lost the ability to talk very early on for some reason. He became monosyllabic very early. But he needed touch. He wanted hugs very often. He wanted people to come and sit with him and hug him. Which was great, except you couldn't do it all day, so you had to kind of figure out some balance between giving Grandpa hugs and getting things done in a day. But he loved it. Excuse me. He loved it so much when I sit down next to him and wrap my arms around him and give him the biggest squeezing bear hug I possibly could give him. And that made him feel happy. So whether it is loneliness or whether it's conversation or some other need, there's going to be a deep need for you to answer an emotional need. And probably the absolute biggest one is fears. Not just fears about Alzheimer's, but fears about life. Rational and irrational. And for Grandpa, those things preoccupied an awful lot of his thinking time. And I'm giving you three just to give you a kind of flavor of what it was like. He was very often concerned for Grandma's health. He was also very often concerned about being abandoned, about people getting rid of him. And he was also oftentimes concerned about the pipes freezing. Two of those are rational concerns, and the third was completely irrational. But I tried to deal with all of them in the same manner. Grandma had serious heart issues. She had them for well over a decade before I came into the picture caring for Grandpa. So it was a known thing. And there were times when I was with Grandma and Grandpa, and Grandma ended up in the emergency room in the hospital because of her high blood pressure issues. Late in the disease, after Grandpa became very unaware of the world around him, there was one time I was leading paramedics upstairs to where Grandma was, while Grandpa sat there blissfully on his couch. Which I was glad at that point he was not aware of it. But there were plenty of times he was aware things were wrong with Grandma, and he would get agitated. And when he was, I'd come to him and I'd speak to him directly. I'd say, this is what's wrong with Grandma today, this is what's being done about it, and this is the prognosis. And then I'd move the conversation on to something else. Or else we would go around and around and around on that subject. And then, if he had issues with being afraid that he was going to be abandoned, I would address him the same way. Because you see, Grandpa knew his disease was a big bird. He was aware when he made a mess on the bathroom floor. He was aware sometimes when he kept me awake all night. And there were some times when he had a particular bad spell when he would say, I don't know what's going to happen. He says, things keep getting worse like this, and pretty soon they're going to stick me in a nursing home. And Grandpa's greatest fear all his life is that he's going to get old and somebody's going to stick him in a nursing home and abandon him. So when he said it outright, I addressed it explicitly. I would say, Grandpa, I knew it was going to get like this when I came to take care of you. And so I'm not going to stick you in a nursing home just because you're making messes. But oftentimes that was a concern that wasn't spoken. You could see it was on his mind, the way he was living, the way he was acting. But if he didn't say anything about it explicitly, I didn't either. I just showed him how I loved him, how I cared for him, and how those problems weren't making me mad at him. And so we had the unspoken discussion about what was going on with Grandpa. Now, in the very end stages, it seemed like this concern left him. At that point, Jean was going to take care of him, and Grandpa didn't have anything to worry about in that regard. Now, then there was many, many irrational concerns. I give you only one as an illustration. The pipes freezing. For Grandpa, it didn't matter whether it's July or whether it's December. If he stuck his hand under the faucet and that water felt a little bit too cold, the pipes were going to freeze. Didn't matter that we lived in a brand new house with great insulation. I imagine somehow in his childhood there's some traumatic incidences with pipes freezing or something, and it became something he would never forget. But if he started agitating about the pipes freezing, I would address his concerns as best I could. He wanted the doors under the sink open so warm air could get under the sink. I'll open the doors under the sink. No problem. Ain't hurting nobody. You want the closet door open so warm air can get in the closet where the pipes are so they won't freeze? I'll open the closet door. The pipes won't freeze now. But with every concern, whether rational or irrational, there's a limit on how far you can go with that person. You can't make the world better. You can't fix many things in life. And so there's a point when you can no longer do something for their concern. And with the pipes freezing, that was when he wanted me to stick my hand in the toilet water to make sure it wasn't freezing. At that point, I'd say, well, Grandpa, I can't do that. Now, the thing is, if you address their concerns frankly and directly, they know they're heard, they know that their concerns are valued, and that their feelings are respected, and they know that you do everything you can to address them. And this means you have a good rapport with that person, you have a good communication with them that will give you a fallback when it comes to the point when you can't go along. So Grandpa didn't get mad at me when I went to stick my hand in the toilet water. It's like, he couldn't understand why I wouldn't do it. It was such a reasonable request. But all right, whatever, we'll not worry about it then. But if you don't develop that kind of bond where they know that they're respected and they're valued, if all you say is no, that's not a problem, that's not an issue, don't worry about it, they feel like nobody cares about them or their feelings or what they're going through. And they get very resentful and very mad. And so when you get to the end of the line and you say absolutely not, you have World War III. You have a big blow-up. So if you can make them know that they're respected and valued and supported, then when you come to the points where you just can't go along for whatever reason, you can avoid having those big explosive incidences. And just in general, you can make them feel happier and more loved if you just address them frankly and directly in that way. And this brings us to the final category of needs, which is spiritual distress. Now, this one is not one that everybody will face. For some reason, either it's a big issue for people, or it's not an issue at all. For Grandpa Purdy, it was a big issue. For my other grandfather, Grandpa O'Keefe, it wasn't an issue at all. So I can't tell you you'll have to face this, but if you do, it'll probably be something very uncomfortable for you, and I kind of want to share what we went through to kind of give you some insight on how you might address it. One day, Grandpa decided to go on a walk. This was early on in his disease. He could still walk. And I decided I had better go with him. It was a nice autumn day, warm and sunny. Grandpa was feeling fairly well, so he made it to the top of the hill where Griffin Road met Glenwood Road before he decided to turn around. When we turned around, Grandpa seemed to collect himself and then said, "I do hope and pray that this curse will be taken away." I said nothing at first. I wasn't certain if he was talking about the general state of things in this out-of-the-blue comment, but I thought not. The way he had gathered himself before making the statement about praying indicated he wasn't making an offhand comment about the condition of the world in general. It was something much more personal, something difficult to say. He said nothing more after a few steps, so I said, "It's hard, isn't it?" "Yes," he said, "it's very hard. I think." Then he stopped. Finally, he said, "I don't know what I think." He spoke no more on that subject, and a little later when he spoke again, it was on a different topic. I wasn't sure he would ever speak so openly about his condition again, but about a week later we had another exchange. On this occasion, Grandpa had gone to bed for the night. I needed to finish some stuff I was doing, so I tucked him in, but didn't go to bed at the same time. I went to check on him a little later and found him sitting up in bed. So I took care of his minor problem and was starting to put him back to bed when he paused and said, "Do you believe that?" "What?" I asked. "What he said," Grandpa gestured toward a CD player. "Do you believe it applies to this age?" Now, he liked to listen to the Bible on a CD when he was going to bed at night. I'd leave that sonorous man up there talking, reading through Scripture, and he could drift off to sleep to it. Now, at that point, I left the Bible on a CD playing, and the section being read was from the Gospel of Mark, where Jesus spoke about faith, saying, "If a man has faith, he can say to the mountain, 'Throw yourself into the sea,' and it will be done." "Yes," I said, "I believe it." "Well," Grandpa said, "some people say there are two ages." I said, "It says elsewhere in Scripture, Grandpa, that all Scripture was written for our instruction, so I believe it, yes." "But some people say, 'Well then, why are you sick?'" Grandpa said. Now we were getting to the heart of what was bothering him. If he had faith, then why was he sick? Couldn't he just tell that sickness to jump in the sea and be done? Was his sickness a sign that his relationship with God was not right? I answered Grandpa. I said, "Jesus' disciples asked Jesus why a man was born blind. They said, 'Because of this blind man's own sin or his parents' sin?' And Jesus told them, 'Neither, but that the glory of God might be revealed in this blind man's life.' We can say the same for your situation, Grandpa." He gave a little chuckle and said something to the effect, "I don't understand why." I said, "I know. The situation of Job in the Bible is a good example. Job suffered very much, and God didn't give him an explanation. God wouldn't explain himself to Job. Job had to accept his situation because God was God. We have to believe by faith that God is a loving and compassionate God." "Yeah," Grandpa said, "it certainly gives you something to ponder." Then, in alluding back to the issue of faith, he said, "I sure would like to be healed from this, or whatever comes down the pike." Grandpa's disease bothered him profoundly. On a spiritual level, he struggled with questions of guilt. The thought nagged at him that God had done this to him in recompense for some past deeds. A few times he openly wondered what he had done to bring the sickness on himself. I tried to comfort him and encourage him as best I could, but often he seemed unreachable when faced with his own private guilt and shame. Like I said, you may never have to face this. It seems to be all or nothing with somebody. But if you do have to face these kind of questions, it can be very uncomfortable. And there can be the natural reaction to want to sweep it under the rug, to tell them, "Oh, don't worry about it, it's fine, you're okay, don't worry." But that is not helping them. You don't have to have all the answers. Sometimes just listening to somebody struggling through this is all they need. But if they ask for Pastor Bob or the priest or whatever spiritual authority they respect in their life to come and talk with them, don't tell them, "Oh, don't bother Pastor Bob, it's not important, we can't bother him." It is important. As important as divorce is for a young couple, this sickness is to them. And if at all possible, you can get Pastor Bob or whoever to come in and talk with them or listen to them. Try your best. Because if somebody is struggling with these kind of questions, it is a huge burden to carry. And we want to do whatever we can to help them through that journey.